Hopefully we're doing these in small enough segments that you guys can use your review questions for your notes and get the main ideas from each of those. So in that last video, we talked about how the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and salt can cause vascular resistance. That vascular resistance is the function of arteriosclerosis that increases vascular resistance. In this video, we're focusing on what's referred to as obesity-associated hypertension. And that's some of the phenomena where when someone gains excess adiposity, blood pressure goes up. The mechanism here is illustrated where obesity or excess adiposity, as you guys know from metabolism, causes an elevated insulin level. So this would be insulin resistance that's causing an elevation in insulin levels. And we're going to see how insulin can influence the function of our blood vessels to increase vascular resistance. This is a little bit simpler mechanism than what we talked about with salt, but it's still very important to understand because of its impact that it can have on blood pressure. So this is the important slide that illustrates the entire phenomena. So again, hyperinsulinemia is the result of excess adiposity. Insulin levels go up, your body's sensitivity to insulin declines. So what we're going to contrast here is what happens with a normal, non-obese person's insulin and contrast that with somebody with obesity-associated hypertension. So what's illustrated in this paradigm is what happens to blood vessels after a meal. So in a normal person, after a meal, they're digesting that food, absorbing the nutrients, primarily glucose, that causes a rise in insulin. During that phenomena, sympathetic nervous system goes up in order to digest that food. That's a natural process that's associated with eating. We saw from that last video that sympathetic activation normally would cause an increase in blood pressure. But in a normal person, insulin causes vasodilation of blood vessels. So you have two things that offset each other so that blood pressure doesn't change. No increase in blood pressure in a normal person following a hyperinsulinemic phase like post-eating. Increase in sympathetic activity, which would normally cause increase in blood pressure. And then this is the important part. Insulin causes blood vessels to vasodilate. So you couple those responses together, that normally causes increase, that normally causes a decrease, so there's no change in blood pressure in a normal, healthy individual. The important part here is to recognize the difference when someone's hyperinsulinemic. So after a meal and insulin levels rise, or any time that insulin is elevated in an obese individual, you see the main difference here from a normal healthy individual to someone with obesity-associated hypertension is that insulin does not cause that vasodilatory effect. That's the abnormal, referred to as a pressor response. And since that response is attenuated, diminished, lessened, what you get is an impaired, instead of blood pressure compensating for that sympathetic activation, you get an elevated blood pressure. So this abnormal response to insulin is what causes obesity-associated hypertension. And if we go back to that, and again, make sure you understand what we're talking about here. We go back to that slide. If you have, an alteration in insulin levels, that's going to cause functional vasoconstriction because you have an impaired vasodilatory response. Why does that happen? It probably involves nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, again, just to remind you, nitric oxide synthase is made from those epithelial cells that line the inside. And if that epithelial has an impaired insulin response, you don't get the vasodilatory response due to nitric oxide. And that lack of nitric oxide release in an obese person impairs that nitric oxide mediated vasodilation, and you end up with elevated blood pressure. That is the pathology with what's referred to as obesity-associated hypertension. When we go back again here, obesity impairs the insulin response, alters that vasodilatory response, and so you end up with an increase in vascular resistance. That's referred to as obesity-associated hypertension.